Mr. Mosebenzi Zwane's affidavit starting at page 459 is admitted, and together with its acknowledgers will be marked Exhibit UU 9. And then I think the next one would be the document with which posed certain questions to him. That is it at 609? Yes, the document which appears or starts at page 609 is admitted and will be marked Exhibit UU 10.
That's the document that goes through to page 622.
Yes.
The questions and answers.
Yes. And then
I was suggesting, Chair, that the questions and answers be admitted together, part of the same exhibit.
I don't think so, because they are not written by the same person. I think they...
Well, that's fine, Chair. Then 609 to page 614 will be Exhibit UU 10.
Yes. And then Mr. Zwane's reply to those questions, starting at page 615,
yes,
will be admitted and marked Exhibit UU 11.
11.
Yeah. Okay.
Chair, I've just been told by those that are responsible for this task that there is already an Exhibit UU 10.
So we may need to make it
9A, 9B.
yeah. So we'll change then the document starting at page 609, which were questions that were sent to Mr. Zwane's attorneys. We'll amend that. It will be marked Exhibit UU 9A. And the document containing Mr. Zwane's response to that, starting at page 615, will be marked Exhibit UU 9B.
Yes, thank you, Chair.
You may proceed, Mr. Pretorius.
Thank you, Chair. Mr. Zwane, your affidavit, which has just been admitted, and the answers to the question deal with a number of topics, as we now know. The purpose of the questions today, however, is to deal only with the housing project that occurred during 2010 and 2011 in the Free State. And at that time, you were MEC for the department, which went through various name changes, but we've referred to it as the Department of Human Settlements. Is that correct?
That is correct, Chair.
We know that the facts underlying the housing project through that period have been the subject matter of a number of investigations, and many of those facts, correct or incorrect, in fact, are public knowledge. We know that. Correct?
Yes, Chair.
However, there are two issues that we would like to concentrate on, and have concentrated on largely, at least, in this week of evidence, and that is the context within which the advance payment project took place, and that's the housing contracts or lack thereof in the first place, and the second is the question of accountability, and it's really those issues that we'll be largely covering. There was, during 2010 and 2011, a public procurement process that was embarked upon by the department. And that involved a tender for the construction of houses in the Free State province. Correct?
That is correct, Chair.
The funding for that project, that housing project, would have come from the National Fiscus, correct?
Correct, Chair.
And the funding was controlled, granted in the first place and controlled in the second place by the provisions of the Division of Revenue Act. We've referred to it as DORA. Correct?
That is correct, Chair.
Yes, other prescripts as well, but that one in addition. It was necessary, as I understand it, to go out on a new tender process for the construction of houses because a decision had been made by the Premier and the Cabinet that the houses should be larger than originally planned. Is that correct?
Well, Chair, I think the two are separated. Normally, each year, the Department of Human Settlement, as it was called by then, would actually build houses. The issue of bigger and better houses was a separate issue added to a normal process that will be followed when building houses in terms of the database. I was informed when I was there.
All right. Well, let's just deal with the facts briefly and by way of introduction to the questions that we would like to put to you, Mr. Zwane. There was, in fact, a public procurement process that took place in the first half of the 2010-2011 financial year.
That is correct, Chair.
What happened is that at the time the bids, the various bids that were presented by various contractors were presented and adjudicated, the tender period, the tender validity period had expired. Correct?
As I was told, Chair.
And a decision was then made to abandon that process. Were you told that as well?
That is correct, Chair.
And
you can keep your mic on, Mr. Zwane.
Okay.
We know that the tender closed on the 16th of April 2020. All that is part of the evidence and the really public record. That the Bid Adjudication Committee considered the bids, and the evidence has been that a number of bids were disqualified. Let me just put the numbers to you for the record. According to the information that we have and the evidence that we've received, 361 bids were received, 105 were disqualified for basic bid compliance reasons, 147 were disqualified because they did not meet the minimum functionality threshold. 109 bids of the 361, including 81 from established contractors and 28 from emerging contractors, were recommended to the bid adjudication committee to be adjudicated on price. Right, and that was the results of the bid evaluation committee's work. They categorized the bids and sent them on to the bid adjudication committee, which then met on the 28th of July 2010. Now, you may not recall the figures, but that's the evidence. You're happy to accept that?
Well, I don't know that evidence, Chair.
Right.
It was not brought to my attention.
That is in fact the evidence. The bid adjudication committee then met on the 28th of July 2010, and at that meeting it was noted that the tender validity period had lapsed. That committee resolved that the tender should be cancelled and a database of service providers, and I presume a new database of service providers, should be established. Correct?
As I was told, Chair.
As you were told. Now, the first question which arises is, I presume that throughout this process you were receiving reports in your capacity as MEC for human settlements as to this process, were you?
No, Chair.
You weren't?
I wasn't. I was expecting a final report on the final outcome because that would determine the date of us starting the building of houses.
Right. By 28 July 2010, it must have been of some concern to you that no houses had yet been built under the allocation that had been granted for that year.
That is correct, Chair.
Were you told that the public tender process had been abandoned and that a database would be created?
That is correct, Chair.
And did you agree to that process?
Yes, I did agree to the process,
Right.
Chair.
Now, why was the tender process simply abandoned and not corrected?
I may not know the details, Chair, but when I asked what is going to be the difference, I was told that the database has been used by previous MECs before me to construct houses, so there will be no issue at all about the database.
Well, this is a new contract. It's to build different houses. The contract required a process to be embarked upon.
That is correct, Chair, but you'll remember earlier on I indicated that the two processes were not categorized under the same kind of understanding. The process of the tender of building houses was as a normal tender which will be entered into year by year. And the process of building bigger houses was not going to be part of the specification that were done in terms of calling for a tender of building houses, as far as I can remember.
Yes, but we know, don't we, Mr. Zwane, that this new database comprised of the parties who had bid in the new tender process in 2010. So these were new entrants onto the scene, and they were being allowed onto the scene without any formal tender process having been embarked upon in respect of their admission at least.
Let me say after the tender was abandoned and the database was followed, there were requirements that were made by EXCO, which is the executive of Free State, that our database should include categories that were not there before, some of them. It should include young people that would, of course, come in with less experience or no experience at all. It should include the disabled, which were not there earlier on. It should also pick on women, which were there but in a smaller number. Of course, the experienced that were there all these years, and it should also consider the geographical spread of the province, because the province is divided into 5 regions, if I recall well. And those were the issues that the database has had to consider. And surely, considering those issues, indeed there would be new entrants in the database. Chair.
All right, let's go back a step. The first group of contractors that formed this new database that was established in 2010 would have been the contractors who bid during the lawful tender process, correct?
That's correct, Chair.
That included those who were disqualified during the course of that process, correct?
I did not go to those details, Chair. All what I requested from the accounting office and the officials is that as they compile the database, they should look into these categories, and of course, they will go back and look at the tender that was abandoned. Not only that, the database had also experienced contractors, I want to believe, that may not have been in this tender process.
Well, that's the evidence. Are you saying you were unaware of the inclusion of disqualified bidders on the database?
That's correct.
So this happened despite the fact that you appeared to have controlled the process. This happened without your knowledge.
I did not control the process, Chair. The process was required to be approved by me. But the details in terms of how the database was compiled, I gave the feedback from EXCO and allowed the officials to do that and bring the product to me.
Well, did you ask them how this database was eventually composed?
I can't exactly recall that, Chair, but what I recall is that when the database, when the final list from the database was presented to me, I had to go through it and checking what I have requested them to try and comply with, because that was the decision by the EXCO.
All right, so the EXCO, that's chaired by the Premier.
That is correct.
The EXCO said that a new database must be composed or compiled. It must comply with certain requirements, and that instruction was passed on to you, I understand. Is that correct?
The EXCO said that the database that we are going to be developing should take into consideration the categories as I've said them, which may actually in a nutshell be called the previously disadvantaged.
Yes, yes. All right. You were given an instruction by the Provincial EXCO, which is a committee of the Provincial Cabinet chaired by the Premier, Mr. Magashule. Correct?
That is correct, Chair.
You were told to compile a new database that complied with certain requirements communicated to you. Is that correct?
That is correct.
You then gave those instructions to officials to compose this database of bidders in their discretion.
The officials which were there, Chair, have been long in that department. It is them that would actually take me through the processes as they did when the tender failed.
Right.
And I could not dictate to them in terms of the nitty-gritties because from where I was seated, that was an administrative issue.
Yes. But the point I'm making is that these nitty-gritties were quite important. These were the decisions that decided or resulted in people being admitted to the database, a discretion of an official, not an open tender process. Correct?
That is correct, Chair.
And did they report to you as to how they exercised their discretion?
No, they didn't.
Did no one say to you, but you can't do it this way? You
No.
can't give contracts for the expenditure of state funds for the construction of houses without going through a proper procurement process. Did no one say that to you?
It is them that suggested, Chair,
Through the officials?
the officials, that throughout the years, the database has been used in the department by my predecessors, and as a newcomer there, I agreed with that process for as long as it was going to help us move forward building houses.
Yes, but here, Mr. Zwane, this is a new database. It's
Yes.
being created after a tender process has been abandoned. Correct?
Yes, Chair.
It's being populated at the discretion of officials, although guidelines have been given to you by Cabinet. Correct?
That's correct, Chair.
No formal tender process, therefore, would precede the granting of a contract to any particular contractor on the database. Correct?
That's correct, Chair.
That is unlawful. Were you never aware of that?
No, I was not aware of it. As I've said earlier on, I was told that this has been the process that has been followed. I even asked, based on what, is it a PFMA process? They told me it's a process under Housing Act.
Who told you that?
The officials.
Which officials? Can you name them?
The HOD at that particular time was Ntate
Mokoena?
Gift Mokoena. The CFO was Mercy Party Dlamini. Those were the anchor in terms of the department.
So you say Mr. Mokoena and Ms. Dlamini told you that it was perfectly in order to just create a database at the discretion of officials without going through a formal tender process before construction contracts were awarded. And you believed them?
They said to me the database, as I was interrogating, should be advertised through different processes, but the database has been used all these years before I arrived. So I believed that because I was not there.
Yes, but you're talking about a database that preceded your arrival as MEC, correct?
That is correct.
In 2010, 2011, we're talking about a new database.
In my understanding, Chair, as I was informed, the database of the previous years would have followed what the officials followed when they were developing a database of 2010.
Yes, well, we're not looking at that for the moment because we know that in the 2010-2011 new database, new contractors were admitted. Correct.
That's correct, Chair.
There is no evidence of any formal tender process, public procurement process, and I stress public procurement process having been followed. Now, you say you were assured by officials that this was lawful. Did you check that?
No, I didn't check it, Chair.
Let me ask this question. Before the tender process that was abandoned, was there, to your knowledge, a database of contractors that the department was keeping?
That's correct, Chair.
Okay.
I was told so.
That's how you were told?
Yes.
And then there was a tender, an open tender process that was embarked upon with special reference to the 2010-2011 allocation.
Yes.
And that process was then, that process, before it was abandoned, had included a determination by the relevant committee of who met the minimum requirements among those who put in bids and who could be considered. Is that right?
That's
so
right,
there were
Chair.
those who were disqualified because they did not meet the minimum requirements, and there were those who were judged as eligible and meeting those requirements. Is that right?
That's right, Chair.
Yes, and then that process was abandoned because, as I understand from other witnesses who have come before you, the tender period had expired. Is that right?
Yes, Chair.
Yes. Now, the discussion about a database, as I understand it, maybe a new database, seems to have happened after the open tender process had been abandoned. Is that right?
That's right, Chair.
In terms of what you were told, or in terms of your understanding, the contractors who would be on the database that was contemplated when you gave instructions to the officials after being instructed by the Executive Council, who was it going to include? Was it going to include those who may have been on the database before the open tender process happened, and those who had put in bids in response to the open tender process? What was your understanding of who would be included in the database that was contemplated?
Well, as I said earlier on, Chair, the detail that the Chair is talking about in terms of the numbers who qualified, who did not qualify, was not brought to me. The information that is presented to me, I would have said to the officials, go develop a database of those who qualifies. Bring it to me. Let's go through it together and just check whether the criteria that the ESCO has requested us to align ourselves with has been met, and then approve the database and start the building of the houses.
But obviously you had a certain understanding when EXCO effectively gave you certain instructions about this, about the compilation of a database. Was your understanding that this was going to be a newly created database?
Yes, Chair, that's correct.
Yes, okay. And what was your understanding as to who would qualify to be in this database that EXCO asked you to ask the officials to put together?
The process of tendering, as this process was started, was a process that I welcomed as an MEC.
Yes.
The process was not abandoned because of me. It was abandoned because of these reasons that officials have put here. which were not controlled by me. I then went back and asked, are you going to re-advertise a tender? Then I was told that no, there is a database that have been used by previous MECs that were here before you, and it is pretty legal. Then I requested the officials to go through and develop that database and bring the final product so that we check the criterion that ESCO has set for us and approve the list.
Was your understanding that in creating that database, the officials were limited to the contractors who were already on the database of the department? Was your understanding that they were not limited to those contractors? They could actually go out of that database and bring in into the database other contractors?
My expectation, Chair, was that where they meet up with hiccups that will require them to go outside the
existing database.
Yeah, they would come back and report so that we find a solution together. But
Yes.
if they bring a database, as I've requested, and I check that the database is according to the criteria that we have set, I approve that database.
Yes, okay. So would it be correct, therefore, to say, maybe subject to whatever requirements, the officials were not limited in any way in terms of who they could put on the list, on the database?
I may not know that detail, Chair.
Yes.
Because in their presentation, they have been dealing with this database.
Yes.
They knew how to go about dealing with this database
Yes.
in a manner that is within the prescripts of the law.
Yes.
So I expected officials to go and follow that procedure and bring the final product to me.
But in the end, whatever list you were given, you accepted that it could include contractors who had not been in the database of the department before. In other words, who were new entrants into the database. Of course, you expected that you wanted to see contractors that were run or owned by women, people with disabilities, and young people included in that list as well.
Those people who will meet the criteria as set by EXCO,
Yes,
in my thinking and my
Yes.
understanding,
yes,
were part of the people who had tendered.
yes.
And when the tender was abandoned, it means those people were part of the scope, because I have not even seen the database before, which was in existence. So when I said they should go back, and when they brought the final product to me, I thought they were able to find everybody they need in terms of the criteria within the prescripts of the law.
Okay. I thought that last part you were going to say within the group of contractors who were either already on the database or who had put in bids. But that's not what you meant, because I think you did say they could get somebody who, other people who were outside who had not put in bids and who were not on the database already. Is that right? You had no problem if they brought a contractor or contractors who had not put in bids and who had not been on the database of the department, as long as they enhanced the issues that EXCO had been concerned about, namely women, people with disabilities, and young people?
I would definitely have asked them what criteria have they followed, in getting these people outside.
Okay.
I would definitely raise that question.
Yes, okay. Mr. Pretorius?
It seems then that during 2010, in fact, in April 2010, a lawful public procurement process was embarked upon by the department in order to identify contractors who will build low-cost housing in the Free State province. That we've established. Correct?
According to my knowledge, Chair.
Yes.
As that was reported to me.
Yes, all right. We have several witnesses who've said that it's a matter of public record. That process was abandoned for whatever reason. That is also a matter of public record. Now, you know about its abandonment, correct?
That's correct, Chair.
The resolution of that situation is one aspect that we will deal with. The other aspect is that I understand that Cabinet, or the EXCO of the Provincial Cabinet, made a decision that a new database should be created comprising people from various categories. That instruction was then given to you, correct?
That's correct, Chair.
And on receipt of that instruction, you instructed your officials to populate the database. But they did so in their discretion under your instruction, correct?
No, that's not correct, Chair.
How were they identified? And who identified them?
On receipt of the instruction by EXCO, I went back to my officials, I related the instruction. A tender process was opened and later abandoned because of the reasons that have been given here to date, which were the reasons not caused by me. Then, after the process, I requested a report in terms of a way forward. That's when this issue of a database was raised to me by the officials. By the officials, the HOD. I did not ask a database from nowhere. The issue was brought to me. It was given to me as an information that the department has been following all these years a database in building houses. And I then requested them to develop that database, taking into consideration the criteria that EXCO has requested us to follow.
So who would go out and identify contractors to put them on the database by applying the criteria given to you by EXCO?
That function is a function that is assigned to the accounting officer, helped by his or her senior officials, Chair. That is why I communicated the message with him.
So in the discretion of the HOD on your evidence, and in the discretion of officials who reported to the HOD, contractors would be identified and put on the database.
That is correct.
And you were informed that that was entirely legal.
That is what I was told, Chair.
What was your understanding of the implications or effects of a contractor being put on the database? For example, in terms of being given a contract or a job.
I did ask that question, Chair. Mm-hmm. You'll remember I responded to that question earlier on, that when I asked that question, I was even told that what was being followed is the act that is called Housing Act. And the development of new database have been a process that was undertaken before I arrived. And having that information, I could not detect at that particular time anything illegal about this process, because I am told by the person who has been there who has spent 15 years with this process, and nobody has challenged this process before. And he says, this is the process that we have been following. Then I gave them permission to follow that process and develop a database as they would normally do.
Is that Mr. Mokoena who was HOD who told you that?
Yes, Chair.
So he's the person who said we can use a database as opposed to an open tender process to award contracts.
Yes, sir.
And he said that it was something that could be done under the Housing Act.
He said that is something that they have been doing.
Yes.
All these years with the previous MECs before me.
Yes.
Yes, Chair.
But I thought you also said, he said, doing things that way was what was provided for in the Housing Act.
Yes, Chair.
That's what
I'm
said.
saying. Yes.
Yes. Oh, okay. But in going back to my question, I understand what you have just said, and it's important. Was your understanding that once a person or a contractor had been placed on the database in this manner that was suggested by Mr. Mokoena, they could then be given jobs by the department without any further process or public process? Or was your understanding that there could still, or there would still be some open competitive process?
My understanding is that they would develop this database. After the database is developed, then the people will be brought forward. Those who have no capacity, the department will devise means to be able to capacitate them in the process of developing them moving forward, but work would start.
Yes.
Yes.
So your understanding was that once they were on the database, then subject to the department helping some who needed to be capacitated and so on, subject to that, they would be given work.
That was the understanding which was given to me, Chair.
And that was given by Mr. Mokoena?
Yes.
Okay. Mr. Pretorius?
Under your watch, Mr. Zwane, 1.4 billion rand was allocated for the construction of low-cost housing, correct?
That is correct, Chair.
I would imagine that wherever the execution of particular tasks lay, that as MEC you would be accountable for the lawful expenditure of that money, let alone the efficient and successful expenditure of that money, correct?
My duty, according to the law, Chair, was to receive reports in terms of the expenditure of that money. The accounting officer will be responsible for the management of the finances of the department in an effective and efficient manner. And any unauthorized expenditure, he had all the right to actually stop or allow it if he allows it. In fact, the law says when there is any instruction given, even by the authority, that has financial implications, that instruction should be given in writing, and the accounting officer, if he or she does not agree with that decision, must in writing advise the authority that that decision can actually have the unauthorized issues. If the executive persuade or instruct further that this decision, a lawful decision, should be done, that should be reported by the accounting officer to National Treasury, Provincial Treasury if we are in the province, and the Office of Auditor General to ensure that he covers himself. Those, according to law, are the powers given to the accounting officer. So if I get a report from the accounting officer that says we are still on track on this matter, I interrogate the report in terms of my knowledge, and if I'm satisfied, and he's happy about the report, then we continue.
Right. Well, two questions arise. The first is that this has been put to Mr. Mokoena, that he was the accounting officer, and he was, to use the term, accountable in terms of the Public Finance Management Act for what happened under his watch, correct?
That is correct.
Is there any explanation as to why he wasn't held accountable for what happened in 2010, 2011?
Well, Chair, I must indicate that until I left the department in 2011, this matter of the illegality of the database had not been brought to the fore by anyone. The structures which would have bring this thing to my attention was Treasury and the audit report. And so at no stage I had ignored, as far as I can remember, a report that points to that direction, that this issue has to be attended to, and then I ignore. No, I don't recall myself ignoring such a report, Chair.
Well, had it been drawn to your attention that anything in the course of the execution of public procurement during 2010, 2011 was unlawful, what would you have done?
I would have acted
How?
on the report based on the seriousness of what has happened, which is illegal. The people who were advising me, the accounting officer, ahead of the pack, would have accounted for whatever irregularity.
No, but what would you have done as MEC? Had you been told during the course of 2010, 2011 that what was being done within the department was illegal, what would you have done?
Would have stopped it immediately.
You would have stopped it?
Yeah, would have stopped it immediately, Chair. My interest was not that much in the names of the people appearing on the database. My interest, as I related to the officials, was that there should be service delivery on the ground as we had promised people. Remember, according to the PFMA, my role is to take the needs of the majority of the people I serve, turn those needs into a policy, determine the outcomes, and hand it over to the accounting officer for implementations and the determination of the outputs. I would have done exactly that.
Well, as I understand you describing the role of an MEC, it's a matter of formulating policy and then handing it to the officials for the execution of that policy. Very broadly speaking, is how you describe it. Do I understand that correctly?
Yes, sir.
All right. Just to summarize so we can move forward, Mr. Zwane, we have two things occurring in the procurement process in the Free State in 2010-2011. First, we have a public procurement process which is abandoned and the creation of a new database. Correct?
That is correct.
Second, we have a decision from EXCO saying that various categories of persons must be identified and placed onto a database. Correct?
That is correct, Chair.
That latter instruction from EXCO went via you to the officials in your department. Am I correct?
To just set the record straight, ESCO is attended by both the MEC and the executive. But in terms of the responsibility of the implementation of the ESCO decision, MEC will have to carry that responsibility going back to ESCO.
I'm sorry, Mr. Zwane, you might have to clarify something. You've just made the statement that EXCO is attended by both the MEC and the executive. Now, EXCO stands for Executive Council. Those are the MECs of the provinces and the Premier. Is that right? That is EXCO.
That is.
Am I right?
You are right, Chair.
Yes. So when you say EXCO is attended by both the MECs and the executive, are you referring to the HODs?
That is correct, Chair.
Okay, all right.
HODs
Yeah,
in
of
the
the
Free
different
State
departments.
of the department, different departments would normally form
Part of the
part of the
executive.
EXCO meetings.
Yes.
Yes.
Is that all the time or only when there are certain issues that they need to deal with?
In the EXCO Free State, most of the time, unless the Premier specify
Yeah.
that in this EXCO we will need only the MECs.
Yes.
But most of the times we both attend.
But just to make sure that when we are all on the same page when we use these terms, when we talk about EXCO, strictly speaking, that is the Premier and the MECs only, but anyone else who attends an EXCO meeting attends by invitation. But otherwise, when you say EXCO, you are not including HODs. You are talking about the Provincial Executive Council. But other people may be invited, and others might have a standing invitation to attend unless excluded. Is that right?
That is correct, Chair.
Okay, so when we say EXCO, we're referring to the Premier and his MECs, but other people may attend on invitation.
That is correct, Chair.
Okay. All right.
The point I was making is that in the Free State,
Yes. Most of the time, the HODs would
the
attend.
HODs were part of the standing invitation
Yes,
to the
yes.
EXCO.
Okay, no, that's fine.
The EXCO meeting to which you've referred, Mr. Zwane, more or less, when did that take place?